quick preface, I highly suggest that you watch the previous videos I made on watercolor textures and diagramming, because those videos cover rendering overlays and they cover clipping masks, compound paths, live paints, expanding live paints, which is what we're going to do in this video. There's going to be a lot of overlays and layering, which are introduced in prior videos. If that's something you're familiar with or comfortable with, then just continue on and keep watching this video. But if you're still a beginner or just you haven't ever touched Illustrator before, I highly recommend watching those two videos before. So in the last video course, we covered watercolor textures and how we could fill massing in whatever design element that you have in Adobe Illustrator with watercolor brushes in Adobe Illustrator. And I showed two methods. One method was using a compound path and a clipping mask, and the other method was using a custom fill swatch. So you can go back and watch that video if you want to learn how to create appearances like this in Adobe Illustrator. In this course, we're going to cover two-tone textures and overlaying renderings with two-tone textures and these watercolor textures. And so if we go here, we're going to use the same massing that we used last time. And I'm just going to use this as a regular color sample. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to live paint this. And from there, I'm going to show you other options that we can use with these two tones. So I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate these outlines. These are basically Make 2D outlines that I grabbed from Rhino. But again, this course is really focused on the Adobe Illustrator aspect. I might tie some things back later in the video, but this is mainly on the Illustrator side. So let's just go in here and let's just make this a live paint. So I'm just going to go in here and select this and just press K. You can also just click here for live paint, but click K, click here. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sample these colors. And if you look at it, there isn't more than 4 sides. So you just need to decide what 4 colors that you want to use. You can be really accurate and assume, one side gets more light than the other, or you can be more diagrammatic and conceptual on whatever looks the best. And so right here, I always like to go from dark to light because it's just easier to find the contrast. And that's the important thing, is contrast. So if I press I can just select here, I, for the sampler, then press K, go back, and I'll do the front face, this dark tone, and then I'll do I again. I'll do the top face, this tone right here, press I again, sample this third color here, do that tone over here, and then the fourth tone over here. Oops, right there. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can repeat the same thing on each of these elements here. So if I go I here, and then I here, and then I here, and then I here, like that. So it's pretty redundant, and but I just want to show you the final result and what happens when you add strokes and you don't add strokes. And then let's sample this one like this, right? And then sample the third one here, sample the fourth one here. You notice I'm using the sampling tool quite a lot, the eye, which is this eyedropper tool. It's very helpful. Okay, great. So we get something like this, right? And so let me just grab this over here and let me just make a duplicate. And let's take the stroke off of this and see how it looks. There you go. And so you get something like this. Now, you might say, okay, that looks all right, but do you see how these two elements here kind of blend into each other? You could technically leave it as this and just let someone's eye, understand that there's going to be there's a distinguishing element between the two masses because you can obviously distinguish this mass from this, or you can be a little bit more literal and add a stroke on here. So in the watercolor video, if you notice, I personally liked it without a stroke because the watercolor is already varied, and so you don't need to distinguish it, but it is a preference. You could add a stroke on there. On here, I would actually recommend adding a stroke, but a very light stroke. And so I'll just keep this here as a comparison, and then we'll go down and make another duplicate, and I'll add a stroke on this one, and I'm going to make it a white stroke, okay? So we'll just go here. I'll just make it white. So that's a white stroke right here, and right now it's at a 1 point value, you see? Obviously, the closer you get, the more you're going to see it. I actually don't like it this thick, but it does help you automatically distinguish the masses. You could, I like to make it as thin as possible, like 0.1, right? And so you get something like this, which I think is very subtle, but it helps your eye distinguish right away. I mean, if you notice, like there's, again, I always have to emphasize this. When you add a stroke on something, it really just changes the effect. Like right here, your eyes start to notice the stroke value. I could technically go in here and make it more monochromatic. Like instead of a white, we can make it like a 2% cyan if we wanted to. And so that might start to blend in a little bit more with, you see that starts to blend in more versus a white. So that you start to notice more of the coloring. So like this one seems more of like a shading exercise or a shading expression of the massing, whereas this one is a clear distinguish of the edges with the massing. Again, I always like things like this a little more. So we can keep pushing the stroke until it's like a very fine line between a stroke and, so that's a 5 point right there. We can maybe, let's see, let's try to go to a maybe 10% cyan. Let's see. Even then, you can still see it. So the reason why I'm going through this, just so you can understand the process, like it's an iterative process when you create things like this. It's not always like a formula, you know. You sometimes have to play around with these things and see what values that you like, what actual aesthetic values you find valuable for you. Let's go here and do 20. There you go. I think this is like the threshold where the stroke color starts to blend in with the actual shading. So like that's like the threshold. You can go back and just make it pure white if you wanted to. Make it like that. There you go. So you see there is a difference. There is a difference in all these three. Let's just go ahead and do, let's just do this one over here. And let me grab these values again. Again, you're going to have probably no more than 1, 2, 3, 4 faces. Let me go ahead and just live paint this. Okay, like that. We can do I for the sampler tool. We can make, since this is, we can make all the front faces this color, and we can make all the underside faces this color. It's up to you. Technically, through like a shading perspective, depending where light's coming from, this might be the darkest aspect of it, right? Because when it comes to this, so there's something called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is where shadow and the reading of an object blends into one, so it's just like pure black. You can't really read the gradient of light anymore, and typically on the underside of the surface, that's where you'll have it. But again, this is more on a conceptual diagrammatic side. And then here, we'll do all these faces this color. Like this. And then again, we're going to take this off here. Let's take the stroke values off of this one and see how it reads. There you go. You see? I mean, this one, because there isn't, well, there is obviously blending of the faces here. So like, but you have a stronger contrast of geometry of the curve. So that really helps read the massing. And so again, we can go here and let's add a stroke. Again, this time I'm going to add a cyan stroke. I'm going to make a 0.1 thickness. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I'm gonna do a 0.1 thickness, and let me get like a 20% cyan on there. And I don't like this line. I don't like that line. Like this. That's not bad. Let's try this again, but instead of the dark, let's make the underside of the arches dark and swap them. So let's go here. Let's just make everything a no fill. Let's do it again. So sample I, okay. Again, I'm being redundant here. You can also hold your live paint. Sorry, I'm being a little. Like this. And then we'll make these faces like that. And then we'll make the front faces this color. We'll make those faces this color. And then let me just grab this here, see a comparison. So let me go ahead here and let's turn the stroke off for this one. And compare the two. And then this one we can have the stroke 0.1, 1% cyan. Let me get rid of those right there. So if you look at these four options, right, you can tell right away how the stroke changes the reading right away. Now, again, you can add backgrounds onto here if you wanted to. You could texture this. Oh, let's go ahead and just give these a texture just so I can show you what happens. So if we go here and we go to Effect, Texture, Texturizer. Right there. You're just playing around to whatever you think looks the nicest and maintains the colors and values. You don't have to use this. You can use whatever you like, you know, whether you want to use canvas or let's just do okay. The same thing over here. I forgot to get this portion right here. I go here, again, effect. I'm going to be redundant just so that you understand and nail it down. And again, you can do this on a lot of different platforms. It doesn't have to be Adobe Illustrator, but I just like to use as little programs as possible. This actually looks fantastic. And then do okay. Now this looks great. And then you can give this an opacity if you wanted to, just because maybe you don't like how dark things are. If you go in here and just lighten it up just a little bit. There you go, like that. So you get that kind of aesthetic as well. And so it's very easy. I mean, you just saw, we just did this like maybe, I don't know, 5-10 minutes maybe. And so it's really important to understand these types of effects and how quickly you can create these types of effects. And again, as I mentioned in the previous recording, sometimes you want to be conceptual like this so that you allow the viewer to place their imagination in your design versus being so literal in what materials you're using. Now, to take it another level, we can start to employ this when you start to maybe do bigger designs or more definitive spaces and architectural elements like floor plates and columns and buildings. And I'm just going to show you how taking this procedure and applying it to something more architectural in a literal standpoint still has the same effect. And starts to give a different feel of how you represent drawings and architecture. So here, I already have this here. This is just a typical Make 2D. You know, you have your basic floor plates and your columns. Very simple. I have like this fluted glass facade. Very, very basic, very general, nothing specific. And I'm not going to go through the entire process here. I just want to show you the step by step because I've already shown these steps in prior videos and in this video. And then from here, I would just go ahead and live paint it. You see? So it's the exact same method. I would take this and just go ahead and live paint the floor plates a certain shade, you know, the columns a certain shade, the underside a certain shade. So if you notice here, there's about, I would say, 3 or 4 different colors we have here, right? We have 1, and then 2, and then 3, right? And 4. I'm not sure if you can tell, but these 2 colors are different, right? Okay. And so from there, we can add like an actual glass cover to this. Do you see? So you see right now, this doesn't have any glass cover to it. It's just the floor slab shaded, and that's it. And you can keep it like this if you wanted to. If you want to keep it diagrammatic like this, you can do that. That's fine. We can go down a step. So if we go down a step here, so do you see now how we have this glass cover to it right here? And so let me go to my layers. Yeah, I have it labeled as window fill. So if I uncheck that, you see it's the exact same thing, right? Or like you could almost make it diagrammatic, and I can like maybe pull this out like this, right? And pull maybe this up if I wanted to, but that just gets a little crazy. But you see, like, this is like a glass cover that I place over this. It makes it feel like it's like a glass cover while keeping it just purely vector, no rendering whatsoever. So this is an option, right? So you have this as an option, right? And then you have this as an option. And this is also all monochrome as well. So if I go in here, you see even the strokes that I have here are all monochrome. So it's all following like this like blue cyan scheme. Now, another option is instead of doing this glass here, we could overlay a rendering on this. Again, it's going to still be this always as the base. It's always going to have this live paint, whatever color scheme, like as the base. And then we can put a rendering over it. And let me show you what happens. So this is a version with a rendering over it. So now it starts to give a completely different reading where it's almost like this blend of realism and abstraction at the same time, right? Where maybe some elements are realistic while other elements are abstracted. And so this is actually very simple. It's only a rendering, a very simple rendering. I didn't even use any fancy render. I just use it directly from Rhino or Rhino Render and Adobe Illustrator Live Paint Fill. That's it. So if I go to my layering right here, right? Right here is the rendering. So let me just turn everything off to I can show you how basic the rendering is. This is the rendering. That's it. It's not even high quality. It's just very simple. I gave the glass a high refraction, and again, it's fluted anyway, so it's going to refract. So it has almost like this fluted glass, channeled glass aesthetic. And so that's on the topmost layer, and I gave it an opacity. You see, I gave it an opacity. And then underneath of it is just the regular live paint. So if I turn this off, you see, that's all it is. That's all you're doing, literally. You're just giving this rendering an opacity of whatever looks the best, and you're just overlaying it on the live paint. That is it. But like you see the effect, like you go from something like this, right? And you go from a rendering like this to something like this. And again, these things they're really cool because it really expands the imagination of the viewer. And so if we go down to the next option right here, so this one is me grabbing a screenshot. This is a screenshot from the rendered view. So up here is an actual rendering. So like on Rhino, if you click on render, right, it's going to give you like a separate rendering. Whereas on the bottom one over here, this is a screenshot. You see, this is literally the screenshot from like the rendered view. Remember how in the previous videos, I would show screen captured a file or view captured a file as the command. So this is literally the view captured a file, and I gave it an opacity of 60%. And again, this one is overlaid on the live paint, right? And so that's all you're getting. It's again, it's the exact same. You see, it's the exact same future. It's just overlaid on the live paint. That's all it is. And so it's very helpful to just understand how you can create these very basic elements and just blend them together. This it's basically an overlay. I mean, you can go on Photoshop and use the layer blending, or you can just do it here in Illustrator where you still have control of your line work. And you obviously want to make sure that you embed your rendering after you scale it to the size you want. And you'll get the same effect, you know? So again, let me just, and I'll show you the final exports of these. Because again, what you see on Illustrator is very different than when you export it final as a PNG or as a JPEG. I'll show that towards the end of the video. Okay, I want to show you another one, another version. So I'm not sure if you remember the Landform building that we created, and I'm going to continue that video later on, but we created this Landform building, right? This file's a little heavy, so it might lag on the video. But again, we have this make 2D of the landform, okay? And one option is we can do a watercolor effect like we have here. You see? So this is the watercolor, and I just did the live paint of the watercolor over here. And in this scenario, I actually have a very light stroke over this. So let me just get rid of the watercolor. So you see here, this is very light, point. You can't tell because let me just click on one of them so you can see. It's a 0.1. It's a 0.1 stroke with like a 20% K value. So I have that overlaid on the watercolor. You see? So if we go back to this one over here, it's like what we did here in the previous video, in the previous tutorial, right? Exact same thing. But I just used, two different, I used the cyan watercolor and a magenta watercolor. And I just, live painted it with this fill. So that's one option. It's just literally two things. It's only a make 2D line work and a watercolor. And so that's option one, right? Now, option two is we can put, like we did another one, put a rendering over it. So right now, this one has a rendering over the watercolor. So let me just turn all of these off right now. So you see that we have this very basic rendering, and it does have an opacity to it. It's 40%. It's not 100%. It's just 40%. And in this one, you're getting the reflection and the refraction of the glass, as you can tell here, and you're getting some of the shadow on the ground plane. And then we just go back and turn everything back on. And then on the watercolor here, the watercolor also has a opacity to it. I think in this one it doesn't. I think it's only 100%. Yeah, it's only 100. This is the true watercolor. It's just that the rendering over it has an opacity because the rendering is over it. And I'll show you the differences in the final. On the final export, it looks fantastic. It looks actually very different than this, and I'll show it to you. But again, this is a really great example of how things, it reads as a piece of architecture, but at the same time, it's abstracted. Now, this one here has the watercolor over the rendering. So in the previous example, the rendering is over the watercolor patch, right? In this example, the watercolor is over the rendering. So the watercolor is going to read a little bit more and a little stronger. So it's really just a matter of preference. So if I turn this off, these two off here, you see how the rendering is here on this bottom rendering layer? If I turn this off, oh, and I turn this rendering on, you see? But the stroke on all of these examples, so the stroke on this is always on the top. Always, and that one does not have an opacity. It's always 100%, 0.1 at like 20% K value. So if I zoom in on here, you see how this is like brighter? It's a little bit brighter, but then you'll start to notice some of the watercolor, I guess, splotches, So it's really, again, a matter of preference. And I will show you, again, the final export, because the final exports look completely different. Again, this is more so of an overview of the techniques. You've already seen an extensive video of how we can create these things. I just want to show you how taking a very simple two-tone and just overlaying it with a rendering can create these effects. It's so helpful to see these techniques because they're so simple. And again, don't underestimate textures, because textures also give this certain quality to renderings and or just to your representational drawings. They tend to work better with solid fills versus like watercolor fills like I showed in the previous video. But let me just go ahead now and show you the exports of these files here, like how they actually look when I finally export it, because what you see on Illustrator is very different than what you see as a final export for both this example and these examples here. Okay, so this is an export. I have this as just a very high quality JPEG. It's a 300 dpi JPEG. And again, I just want to show you the process of what we did, right? We went from just pure Make 2D line work from Rhino. And then from the Make 2D line work, we took it to Illustrator, and then we live painted it with, just a monochrome, I guess in this scenario, like a 4-tone color of cyan. Again, this is just pure color. And you can stop here if you wanted to. If you wanted to say, this is how I want to represent my drawing, you can stop here, and that's fine, because it's showing you enough detail for you to understand things. Now, from here, the next option is, we start to add a representation for the glass. So it starts to fade that background of the actual massing. Another option is, instead of using this shading of the glass, you can put a rendering over it, and that's how this is going to look. So you see, it looks very different once you export as JPEG versus looking at it on Illustrator. And then another option is taking it, as a screen capture from Rhino and overlaying it with the colors that we used. So a lot of different ways of showing the same thing. You see, it's just very different styles. Let me go ahead and show you the Landform building that we worked on a couple weeks ago. So this is the Landform building. Again, if you notice, this one here is with the rendering above the watercolor, and this one is the rendering below the watercolors. If you know, you can already notice the difference right away, right? So the watercolor here is, I guess, softer. It's not as expressive. It's a little bit muted, whereas here the watercolor here is very expressive, and the rendering is a little bit more muted. So let's just zoom in here to see. Like, even you zoom in, it looks fantastic. Like you can read that this is actually glass. I mean, the refraction's a little crazy here because it's curved glass, but you can read all of the shading, and you can read the differences between the steps, and that you can tell that this is glass, right? And so let's go down here. I mean, here, I would say I'm not a fan of this. I think this is a little bit too strong, and this looks a little too repetitive over here. But then again, some people do like that aesthetic, and just want to show the two differences of options here. I mean, it's the same thing here, but again, because the rendering is over the watercolor, it's a little bit more muted. And then let me show you the only watercolor with the stroke over it. So this one's the only pure watercolor fill with the stroke over it with no rendering. And so as you can tell, the difference is you start to tell if there's a difference. This looks more like a drawing, right? Whereas the rendering here, you can start to read a little bit of the rendering. I just want to show the two side by side. You see, there's just a huge difference of how you read these things when you play around with strokes or overlay rendering. So I hope you found this helpful. Again, I highly recommend that you go back and look at the previous videos, especially the watercolor fill video. If you want to do something like this, if you want to do more of a watercolor fill method. And again, don't forget, in that video, I show you two different methods. So if one way is a little bit more complicated, there's always another way that you can do it. And do not underestimate what you can do with a little bit of color and a very simple rendering. You don't have to go and do these crazy renderings if you don't want to, or if you're a little bit more intimidated with doing hyper realistic renderings. You can do so much with just a very basic rendering and a very basic understanding of how to express colors. I just want to quickly show you how I created that very basic rendering that you just saw on Adobe Illustrator for this fluted building. If you go on your render options here, it doesn't matter what version of Rhino you're in. I just made sure that it was on final high quality, and down here on my samples. Again, I don't need anything fancy. I just did 50 samples, which is super low. You can do 1,000 samples, 2,000 samples. You can increase the quality here, but make sure you override the production rendering. And then obviously the output, if you have a very big screen, I just use the output of my screen, which is a 32-inch 4K screen. So I'm not really worried about that. And then literally I just click on render over here, and the render is going to pop up. And you wanna make sure. So Rhino 8 already comes with a denoiser. If you don't have a denoiser, you could install one of the packs from Rhino 7 that gives you, I guess, like an NVIDIA denoiser and an Intel denoiser and an AMD denoiser. It's up to you. But the denoisers are a must. Definitely use them. And again, it's so basic. The rendering is so simple. And I just go in here, I save, and I make sure that I save it as a PNG. Nothing, nothing special, just to maintain the transparency. And then the screen capture, is literally this. The only thing I did though is I made all of my shadows blue. So if I type in options, right? And I go down to view, and I go display modes, and I go to render. Again, in my diagramming video, I do show how to modify these settings in depth. If I go to shadows, I can change the color of my cast shadows, and I can make it blue, for example, right? And I can do okay. And then if I go to rendered and I go down to the scene lighting, I can make my ambient lighting also blue. So anything that's a shadow or cast is going to be blue, you see? And then I just did view capture to file, and I made sure it's a transparent background. And so that's how I got those to overlay. And again, make sure you save it as either a PNG or as a TIFF if you want to maintain the transparency. That's all you do. And again, those two very basic, renderings, just overlaid with a little bit of color, a little bit of texture, it'll change the effect, and you'll see further down the video what the final results are. What you're seeing right now is just a recap of what we did earlier in the video. Again, I cannot stress enough to watch the previous videos, especially the watercolor texture video and the diagramming video. Those two videos cover overlaying renderings. They cover compound paths, clipping masks, live paints, expanding live paints. These things are not only helpful in this video and prior videos, but it'll be helpful in the future when you're making any type of graphic element, whether it's architectural or any other design element. Again, if you have any comments or questions, just leave them in the comments section below, and I will be releasing more videos about representational drawing, so please keep your eyes peeled for those upcoming videos. Thank you.